All right. So, welcome to our very first webinar for Thrive. Our very first webinar is Elevate Your Practice, Become an OCD and Anxiety Specialist, Transform Lives, and Your Practice by Choosing a Rewarding Niche. So, in this webinar, we are going to talk all about OCD in some detail, and then we're going to talk about how awesome it is being an OCD specialist. So we'll start off by taking a couple minutes to introduce ourselves and then we will hop in. So my name is Danielle Henderson. I'm a licensed professional counselor and I have a doctorate degree in clinical psychology. I'm in Pennsylvania and I am the founder of Thrive.
And my name is Megan Lisi. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist residing in New York. I also do have a couple of cross licenses as well in a few other states. I love this work. I fell in love with this work a few years back and haven't turned back since. So, really looking forward to going through all of this with you guys today as well.
Yes. Thank you for being here, everybody. Let's hop in.
All right, so let's start just by defining OCD. So, OCD is characterized by these unwanted, intrusive thoughts, but it could also be urges, images, doubts, and or these repetitive behaviors or what we call mental acts or mental behaviors that a person feels really inclined to do in order to get rid of the anxiety or the distress that they experience due to those obsessive and intrusive thoughts that they're having. OCD is extremely debilitating. There's a spectrum of that, of course, that we will see all the way from mild all the way up to extremely severe. But in order to meet criteria for the diagnosis, which we're going to talk about also momentarily, there has to be distress and impairment in the individual's day-to-day functioning.
Mhm. The prevalence of OCD. So we have a slide where we're going to talk about, the demand versus what's actually out there in terms of therapists. But we'll share a little bit here too. So OCD, it affects approximately 2 to 3% of the global population. So it's a very common mental health condition, and it doesn't discriminate in terms of age, race, backgrounds. Typically, it begins in childhood or adolescence. Now, people might not actually come in for treatment until adulthood. There are some statistics that say that it take about 17 years on average for people to get into the appropriate treatment. So sometimes people are suffering, unfortunately, for a very long time before they get into care. With OCD, it has a chronic course. So that means that once you have it, you have it, you can't cure it, but it's very treatable and can be very manageable with appropriate care. Average age of onset is around 19. And if we look at stats just in the US, there's about 2 to 3 million adults that have OCD in the United States and about 500,000 youth. So lots and lots of people, unfortunately, living with OCD.
Yep. And that 2 to 3%, I like to envision it a little differently so it's more tangible. I think it's about 1 in 40 people with that
Mhm.
statistic. So if you picture, I mean, I have a big crazy family. So if I picture a big backyard barbecue with all of them, that means at least one individual in that group is going to meet criteria for this disorder at some point in their lifetime.
Yeah, that's a nice tangible way to break it down.
So let's get into, I know this can feel a little boring talking about DSM-5 criteria sometimes, but we'll move through it just because it's important to define more clearly. So we have to have the presence of obsessions, compulsions, or both. Although Danielle and I were even talking prior to logging on here, I don't think I've ever worked with a case where compulsions weren't present. Sometimes they're just really hard to identify. Obsessions we define as these recurrent and persistent thoughts, urges, doubts, images that are intrusive, unwanted, and they have to cause marked stress. The individual really tries to get rid of the thoughts or suppress them or ignore them. And this is what we call compulsions, right? So the compulsions are defined as these repetitive behaviors. And like I said earlier, they're either physical behaviors, things like hand washing, ordering things in a certain way, checking things, or mental acts. So we typically don't think of behaviors as things that we can do in the mind. So this hopefully sheds some light on the way that these compulsions can show up for you as well, or for people suffering from this disorder. Praying, counting, repeating words silently to yourself, that person feels really driven to perform these in response to the obsession or according to very specific rules. So an example of that might be, I have to repeat a certain phrase a specific amount of times. Not just repeating it is good enough, but a certain number. And that's where a lot of that rigidity can come in as well.
Mhm. Right. Definitely. The other criteria, so the compulsions, they're aimed at preventing or reducing distress or prevented some kind of dreaded event or situation. So we'll see this too, right? So not only is there a function of trying to take away distress or discomfort, but, you know, I need to do this so that a bad thing doesn't happen. And usually the bad thing is like a horrendously awful bad thing, like a catastrophic worst case scenario, not like, a mild, somebody's going to stub their toe, right? Um, the behaviors or mental acts either are not connected in a realistic way with what they're designed to neutralize or prevent, or they're clearly excessive. And this is something that can be really frustrating for people living with OCD because when they get a little space and get away, they're like, I can see that this isn't logical or rational, and it's probably not even really doing anything to prevent the bad thing, but it feels like I have to, or it feels so risky not to. So, really taking a look at that too. Um, it has to be time consuming. The DSM lays out that it needs to take up at least an hour per day, or cause clinically significant distress in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And then here come the standard that is with kind of every mental health condition in the DSM, right? It can't be better explained by another mental health condition, illness, injury, or substance use. And then you can also put specifiers on OCD in terms of their insight level.
So let's talk a little bit about what OCD is versus what it's not. So OCD is this like intolerance of uncertainty. That's kind of the common theme across everybody who's suffering from this disorder. If it's uncertain, it feels really, really debilitating and impairing and intolerable. It's something that we call ego dystonic, meaning the thoughts and the experiences are the polar opposite of what this individual actually wants and values. So you'll hear them say things like, I know that I have this thought, but it's the last thing I would ever want to do. Or I'm having this image popping in my head and I really don't want it to be there. It really bothers me so much. It's the opposite of what this person wants to be thinking, wants to be doing.
Mhm.
Debilitating and impairing, which we've probably emphasized enough at this point, but we'll keep saying that. And it's a mental health condition that really requires very specialized evidence-based treatment. I can't begin to tell you how many times I've run into clients that have come in doing other types of therapies that have only worsened their symptoms. And we know
Mhm.
that we see this with other disorders, but OCD is really special in the sense that most other therapies are pretty much guaranteed to increase the symptoms if it's not being done based off of research and the way that we know it needs to be approached. So keep
Yeah.
that in.
I think us beating the horse with the debilitating impairment is really important though, because um, I think just collegially, sometimes out and about in the world, people are like, oh, I'm so OCD, right? Or like, oh, I like, my drawers to be organized. I'm so OCD, right? And that really, um, like devalues what a person with OCD actually lives through, right? It's not something where they're like, oh, this is a preference. It's super debilitating and very impairing.
For sure. And we actually go into some really good examples of that in our training program that we have. So check that out as well if you're interested in learning more. But yeah, you'll hear, people throw around the term a lot, and most people are not trying to be harmful, but unfortunately it's really stigmatized this disorder over time, and it makes it very hard for people who are experiencing true OCD to come forward and talk about their symptoms. So
Mhm.
OCD is not desired and beneficial. It's not, oh, I'm so good at cleaning my house because I have OCD. It's not an adjective, it's not a personality quirk, and it is not always about what the general public seems to refer to it as, which is cleanliness and like organization and symmetry. There are so many other themes or what we call subtypes of OCD that we'll get into momentarily as well. Even though contamination and the symmetry OCD are in that grouping, they are not the most common ones that you're going to see.
Hmm. Definitely. So in terms of what OCD can sound like, I always talk to people that if it starts with a what if, that's usually the glittery, sparkly red shouting flag that it's probably OCD talking. So that what if I just figure this out, insert whatever. I just need to know. So, really, with OCD, it comes in with this need for certainty. It has a really strong sense of urgency. Like, I need to know, I need to figure this out, I need to do something or else. And then, very, very fear driven. So, it's not like, oh, I just need to do this thing, just because. It's very much, I need to do this thing or else somebody's going to get hurt. I need to do this thing or else I could cause serious harm to others. I need to do this thing to prevent me from, doing something unspeakable, right? So it's very, very fear based.
And I think one that we don't talk about as often sometimes is the revisiting of the past.
Hmm.
So I remember when I was first learning about this disorder, there were light bulbs going off about clients that I had worked with that absolutely met criteria for OCD, and I just didn't have the information for it at that time. And past events, the reviewing of something that one experienced and revisiting it over and over again in their mind or out loud, seeking reassurance about it, trying to find certainty around that situation to confirm that they didn't do something bad or they're not a bad person. That's a really common way that this disorder shows up as well.
Definitely. Yeah. So any situation or anything that really preys on not having 100% certainty and not having 100% control is just like a petri dish or just food for OCD. And that leaves a lot of things open to be preyed upon.
Yep. So this is my favorite topic, by the
Yeah.
way,
Same.
talking about all the ways that OCD can show up, because again, I think this is the light bulb moment for a lot of people. It is not just the contamination and the symmetry, like I had shared, although we do include that in that list because you will see that show up as well.
Mhm.
But let's talk about some other common subtypes. And Danielle, I might kind of pick your brain to see if you have any examples you want to share about some of these other ones that
Sure.
I'd love to hear about a little bit of a presentation of how
Oh,
they
yeah.
may.
Okay.
So we got contamination, just right, symmetry, right? So that's like this thing needs to be aligned a certain way, or else I can't walk away from it. It doesn't feel okay. It needs to be put in a certain place, or else something bad could happen, or else I just feel so uncomfortable that I
Mhm.
can't move on until it is that way. Then we've got these other ones where I think sometimes the misdiagnoses come in. Relationship OCD is the first one here.
Mhm.
Danielle, any thoughts on that? You want to share a little bit about how relationship OCD might sound?
Yeah. So relationship OCD, it can pick on. So I think most commonly we think about it with like romantic or partner relationships. It can also show up in other relationships like family members or friends. But usually more commonly seen in like romantic, intimate relationships. So it can show up as what if I'm in the wrong relationship? What if my partner isn't right for me? It can also pick on perceived flaws or failures in the partner and really magnify and kind of blow those things up. What if I'm not attracted to my partner? And then I'm getting ahead of us, Megan, but sexual orientation OCD is at the bottom, but sometimes it can fall right in with relationship OCD because, if you're questioning your sexual orientation and you're in a relationship, then it's usually like, well, I'm in the wrong relationship because, I'm actually gay or I'm actually straight or I'm actually bi, right? So those can really feed off of each other.
Yeah, I definitely see those come together as a pair more often probably than not. Another very stigmatized one is the POCD or the pedophilia OCD. So
Mhm.
these are these doubts about what if I could be a predator? What if I harmed a child? What if I did something that I don't recall that was inappropriate towards a kid when I was younger or last week or yesterday? Again, I just want to make really clear these are ego dystonic thoughts. They are the opposite of what this individual would ever do. So this doesn't align with the individual's values. They're so terrified of even the possibility that they're a human being that could take an action like that, that they want to do everything possible to prevent it from happening. We know that people with POCD are probably the safest people to have your children around because they're constantly thinking and obsessing about this and wanting nothing of harm to ever take place. So that's very different than someone who has desire towards children, right? So anything you want to add there, Danielle?
Um, no, I think you hit it. Just there tends to be a lot of guilt and shame, especially, and like disgust that come along with this subtype too. So just really keeping in mind that, yeah, you're gonna see the anxiety, the fear component, but then there's also gonna be all of these other underlying, like very heavy, sticky emotions that are gonna come with it too, typically.
That's such a good point. A lot of avoidance behaviors with this particular subtype as well. Again, with the idea of I just need to stay away from all kids so that way
Hmm.
I, one, don't feel triggered, and two, I could never possibly do anything harmful, even though I know I would never harm a child. So,
Hmm.
things that you'll commonly hear with that subtype. Up next, we've got scrupulosity. So, this tends to be a lesser known subtype as well. Danielle, anything that you want to share about scrup?
Yep. So, oh, you'll hear us call it Scroop. It's kind of in the OCD community, right? Like you just shorten it to Scroop. It's easier. So with Scroop, we can have religious or moral. So it can show up in some different ways. So with religious group, um, really honing in on a person's religious beliefs. Did I do something to offend God or my higher power? Am I going to go to hell? Did I sin in some way, shape, or form? Did I not pray in the right way? So it's really going to hone in on those aspects. Moral scroop is looking more so at a person's, morals, right? Like, did I cheat on a test? Did I lie? Did I steal? Did I do something, bad, immoral, etc., that wouldn't make me a good person. So it's really going to come at it from that lens.
Yep, and some compulsions there, like you started mentioning, the really rigidness of the prayer, where the individual gets away from just engaging in prayer out of a value-based behavior, and now it becomes this rigid set of rules of I have to do it this way or else I can't go to sleep. And
Mhm.
that gets them further and further from their own spiritual belief. So
Mhm.
people back in the way that they want to be practicing, not the way that they feel like they need to in order to not feel anxious about it.
Yep.
Existential. This is an interesting subtype as well. It's sometimes hard to identify because it's probably one of the least tangible than some of the other subtypes on.
Mhm.
And these are concerns and doubts about your existence, your reality. I've heard people say, like, what if I'm not real or my family's not real? How do I know for sure that we're not living in a simulation? And again, the difference here is that zooming out, the person can say, I know this sounds ridiculous. I know this sounds irrational, but it feels so real in the moment, especially when something comes up that's triggering. So, existential is definitely an interesting subtype. I think we're going to see this on the rise more and more as AI continues to develop. I don't know
Oh,
about you,
I
Danielle.
have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've definitely seen it increase recently.
Mhm. Yeah. This existential can be a tough one too, because this if people are going to come in with a misdiagnosis, this is a place where people can come in with a misdiagnosis. So I've seen people who have come in, diagnosed with some kind of psychotic disorder, and you talk to them and you're like, you're not psychotic, like you're reality tested, it's not like delusional, it's not fixed, right? So you kind of rule that out, and then you get talking to them and it's like, oh wow, it's really like the uncertainty and the doubt running the show here. So at least that's what I've seen working with clients with this subtype.
Definitely. Yeah, and I'm glad you bring that point up because again, we talk a lot about misdiagnosing with this population. Oftentimes, when we get clients, and hopefully, as you guys start doing this work at some point, if you enjoy it as much as we do, there's a lot of misdiagnosing going on in the community still. So, still a lot of information that needs to be shared and spread about this disorder. So that way we can reduce that more and more as time goes on.
Hmm.
Let's get into harm OCD. Arguably, POCD, the pedophilia OCD, is almost like a form of harm OCD. The overarching theme there is what if I could do something to harm somebody, or what if one of my actions causes harm to someone? Any any specific examples you want to give there, Danielle, about how this might show up?
Yeah, harm. I really enjoy working with anything that falls under the harm umbrella. So with harm, it could be, sometimes people have worries that they might have like poisoned other people's food or worries that they might stab people, smother their husband. So it can show up as harm to others, hit somebody when I'm driving, but it can also show up as harm to myself. So what if I what if I lose control and kill myself? What if I want to kill myself? Or, what if I maim myself in some way? So it can really focus on harm to others and harm to self.
Yep. And then we've got some postpartum and perinatal OCD. We see a lot of mothers who come into treatment with very debilitating OCD symptoms that sometimes develop during this time frame for them. They may
Hmm.
not have had significant instances of anxiety or OCD symptoms leading up to that. It could be hormonal related. There could be other factors that kind of set the disorder off during this time. But I mean, it's heart wrenching when I see some of these cases because these are the ones where you've got new moms who are terrified of even holding their child
Hmm.
or changing their child's diaper because they're so scared that they could do something that could hurt the child or do something wrong that could cause a problem for the child. Bathing is usually a big trigger with this as
Hmm.
well. What if I drown my kid, even though that's the last thing they would ever want to do, but the thoughts, those intrusive unwanted thoughts pop in and it just creates all these avoidance behaviors again, or having their partner, if they have one in place, do all of the child's care at that point in time. And that's hard to see as well.
Hmm. Yeah.
Anything else that I missed there that you want to chime in on that
No, I
one?
think that's just, I mean, exactly that, right? It's these really intense fears about either harming the baby or harm coming to the baby in some way, shape, or form.
Yep. And then we've got sensory motor OCD. So this is focused on these physical behaviors, sensations like eye blinking, breathing. I'll kind of give you a real world example with this as well. I had a client that really struggled to sleep at night because she couldn't stop focusing on what if I don't breathe? What if I
Yep.
stop breathing? And then really doing compulsions around like making sure she's taking a certain amount of deep breaths and counting the inhale and the exhale. And again, you can imagine how debilitating that could be.
Mhm.
Any other examples on that one, Danielle, that you want to share?
I think it's exactly that. It is your brain not trusting that your body or your body and the OCD not trusting that your brain can do its job, right? So that part, your brain stem that is
Yeah.
responsible for all those automatic processes, like breathing, heartbeat, things like that. OCD is like, what if your brain just decides not to do its job anymore?
Yep, exactly. Debilitating fear around that body just not functioning in the right way.
Mhm.
Um, Definitely very time consuming and distressing, just like the rest of these subtypes. You already touched on the sexual orientation OCD, so I think we can move on to our next slide.
Mhm. And I did see that we have a question in the chat. We'll grab it at the end, so hang tight with us. All right, so common distortions that tend to be common with OCD. So these are, a lot of these coincide with the CBT model of thinking errors and cognitive distortions. We've got a little reference you can grab and check that out too. So we've got all or nothing or the black and white thinking. So, it's either, totally safe or totally dangerous, or it's all this or all that, right? It doesn't leave any room for anything in the middle because the uncertainty or the gray is what's scary. Catastrophizing. This is taking something and really blowing it up and magnifying it to that worst case scenario. I haven't met anybody with OCD yet where it's like, oh, just this, mild, slight consequence is going to happen. It's like a horror story of what's going to happen, right? And that's what keeps people in it and keeps it so scary. Thought action fusion. I like to talk to people about this as like I think therefore I do. So there's a fusion that like thoughts get equated to being just as bad as actions, right? So just because I thought something, that means that I did it or I'm going to do it or that I want it, right? So it can really um make things feel extra sticky. Overestimation of threat and underestimation of our ability to cope, super common with OCD. So it paints us this very scary story that it says is, very likely to happen, even though if we were to have somebody, oh, what's the probability that that would actually happen? With some space, they'd probably say, like, oh, it's pretty low, but in the moment, it feels like it's definitely going to happen. So it's like, all right, this is definitely going to happen. And when it does happen, you're not going to be able to handle it. You're not going to be able to cope. So super damaging message that you're not going to be able to handle it piece. Emotional reasoning. This is, if something feels off, it gets deemed as like bad. So it's like, oh, I feel like anxious about it. Therefore, this thing must be bad in some way, shape, or form, right? So we're thinking with our emotions with OCD. And then the exaggerated responsibility we see a lot. So, I am in some way, shape, or form responsible for like preventing something I have no control over.
And I want to just jump on one of the points you made about
Yeah.
the possibility versus probability. That's one of the really common character traits of OCD is that it's getting its victims to think through the lens of everything that is just a slight possibility is the probability. That's all they
Mhm.
can see is that small window in a lot of moments. Really hijacks the amygdala in the brain and gets everybody to be in fight or flight mode pretty much. In many parts of their day every day. So while it's technically possible that I could walk outside and trip and fall and break my leg, the probability of that happening is pretty slim.
Mhm.
While it's possible I could get in my car and get into a car wreck today, the probability of that is pretty slim. But when you're thinking through the lens of the possibility being the only thing you're really seeing, imagine how scary life can feel walking around.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, those are great points.
So, OCD versus normal intrusive thoughts.
Funny quotes.
Yeah, in the quotes because thoughts are thoughts and that's really the message that we want to teach across the board. Intrusive thoughts are very common. Up to 94% of people actually experience them. I had one just the other day. I remember it clear as day because it kind of rattled me in the moment a little bit. I was taking my dog outside and I thought about, again, totally unconnected, but my aunt who lives down the road has a couple of dogs. And my brain said, what if you take her dogs out at some point and you leave the gate open and they get out and get hit by a car?
Mhm.
And it's just this thought that just comes in automatically and it kind of shakes you up momentarily. But the difference is someone without OCD is able to see that and be like, oh, that's weird. Okay, moving on, right? I'm going to go right back about my day. Or you might not even notice them at all. They're
Mhm.
so insignificant. Someone with OCD can't just shake that off. It becomes the focal point, not only of that moment, but sometimes for hours or days following that experience. They can just pop in automatically, like I shared. They could be triggered by very specific objects or situations or, um, media content. Like there's a lot of different triggers that somebody can experience that kind of set off their specific intrusive thoughts and experiences. But a large part of the population actually experiences these. So we want to think through the lens of thoughts are just thoughts, and we want to teach that to our OCD sufferers because that's going to be the thing that helps them distance themselves from falling into the rabbit hole every time one of those thoughts actually shows up for them.
Mhm.
I think I spoke to most of this here. I don't need to kind of review, but if there's anything else that you want to add in, Danielle, before we go on to the next one, feel free.
Yeah, I'll typically give people an example of like an intrusive thought that I think like most people have experienced. So if we think about driving, you know, have you ever had the thought when you're driving of like, hey, what if I cut my wheel really sharp and I just fly my car off the like little bridge or, throw it into the guardrail or whatever? I think most people have had some variation or flare of that intrusive thought, and then talking about, like, "Oh, interesting, that thought, we were able to kinda, like, dismiss and let it rub off and move on with it." That's the relationship that we wanna start to develop with any other thought that our brain decides to just toss into our heads.
Yep.
So we've talked a lot about what OCD is, what it isn't. This is the OCD cycle. We've got a cute little picture here. So really when we think about OCD and how it operates on the principle of negative reinforcement. So if you're like, "Ooh, those behavior classes were a hot minute ago. I kind of remember what negative reinforcement is, but not really." Let's break it down. So negative reinforcement means you come in contact with something averse or some kind of like unpleasant stimuli. Then you do a behavior. Your behavior takes away the unwanted stimuli, and then that's the negative part, right? It takes away something unpleasant. And then you learn in the future, hey, next time I experience this unpleasant thing, do this behavior again. That's the reinforcement part. So with OCD, there's the intrusive thoughts or the obsessions that come in. You get an unpleasant, unwanted feeling. It could be anxiety, disgust, guilt, shame, just anything you don't want to feel, right? So there's our aversive condition. You do a compulsion. The compulsion gets rid of your distress. You get a little bit of relief, and then you learn, yes, next time I have that unpleasant, thought and feeling, do the compulsion, feel better for a brief amount of time. And then the cycle gets stuck. Rinse and repeat.
Yep. And I'll speak very briefly to that little light bulb at the top right corner there.
Mm.
So even with my dog intrusive thought
Yeah.
example, right? It becomes meaningless because I decided not to attach meaning to it in that moment. Thoughts are meaningless until we determine that they have meaning. So that could have gone in a different direction for me if I said, why am I thinking this right now? This must mean something. Let me make sure I call my aunt to make sure the gates are locked, or I go drive down the block to go check to make sure that the dogs are okay. That's when it starts to shift into this behavioral change that becomes really impairing in our functioning and starts to take up time versus when we say, oh, that's just a thought that my brain generated. Let me not do anything with that right now. And I'm going to turn my focus right back onto what I was doing and move on with my day. Then this cycle doesn't end up happening. So that's part of how we help break this cycle as well and not reinforce our thoughts by behaving towards them through those compulsions.
And sharing this information with clients can be very empowering because they're like, you can walk them through each of the steps. And then when they start to see it and see how it works, they're like, oh, okay, like I got it. Right. So it's building awareness and just empowering them with knowledge. So why not? Right.
Yeah, definitely. And really briefly, and this can be a talk for another day, but this is the OCD cycle, but this really does apply to a lot of other anxiety disorders. So keep that in
Mm-hmm.
mind too, because this knowledge really can be power. You can spread this to anybody you're working with that may be suffering from some other form of anxiety, any phobias, social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder,
Mm-hmm.
hooked and latched on to anxiety, if we kind of follow the steps that we're going to start briefly talking a little bit about when it comes to the approach we use, we can help break this cycle.
Yep. Definitely.
So, OCD and stigma. it's misunderstood. Again, if we haven't sent that message already, I'm going to repeat myself here. So, this leads to a lot of isolation for those who are struggling with this disorder. And when we address the misconception, this is going to help improve mental health awareness across the board. It's going to help people get connected to appropriate care. It's going to equip them with the understanding and the knowledge of what kind of therapy that they actually need in order to get better long term.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we see it across the board, right? Like I came across some horrendous shirts the other day that were saying things like OCD, obsessive cryptocurrency disorder, or like one was like about a bird. I forget what, but it started with a C. It was some kind of parrot. But anyway, so across the board, there's this misconception and stigma, and then definitely with like some of the taboo subtypes, right? There's a lot of fear for people, fear of disclosure might mean bad consequences, especially with POCD, worried that they might get in trouble, or people who have postpartum OCD and fears about, causing harm to their baby. They're worried that they might get their babies taken away from them, right? So, really, unfortunately, just widely understood.
Yeah, big consequences that are sadly rooted in reality. I've had
Hmm.
multiple clients come from situations like that over the years. People who have been wrongfully hospitalized, people
Hmm.
who have had things taken away from them, people who have lost their jobs, people who have been thrown out of their religious institutions, so on and so forth. So the consequences are really big. That's why we make such a big deal out of the stigma associated with this as well.
Yep, definitely. So let's talk a little bit about the treatment, right? So, ERP is the treatment we're going to talk about, and ERP is exposure and response prevention. It's evidence based and is credited as the leading or like frontline treatment for OCD. It falls under the CBT umbrella, and there's not as much of a focus on the C, right? It's more of like a B therapy. So with ERP, we work on gradually, keywords, why it's bolded, exposing a person to the fear as a means to build resiliency and tolerating their discomfort and uncertainty while we're resisting compulsion. So, said in a simpler way, we work on gradually having people move towards their fears and triggers while we're cutting down and getting rid of compulsions.
Yep. So what's so important here is really understanding what response prevention is. The RP part of ERP is the most important part of this treatment. So
Mhm.
response prevention is the, if you've heard like the term sitting with it,
Oh,
sitting with the distress, sitting with the discomfort, being with the anxiety. It doesn't literally mean you have to sit still and be in like a meditative state with discomfort. It just means allowing those feelings, those sensations, the thoughts to be present without changing your behavior compulsively towards them. This can look like a start in treatment of delaying the compulsive behaviors or mental acts, reducing them, and then ultimately our end goal is to resist them altogether. And when someone's able to achieve that, and there's no such thing as perfection, but when we can get a client to the point where they're really resisting the majority of their compulsive behaviors, that's where they're going to get to see the most successful outcomes and how good they can feel as a result. So these mental compulsions, and I think we highlight that here because those are the ones that tend to get missed. The physical behaviors are much easier to see. The things that go on in someone's mind are harder to identify. So, as specialists, we learn how to ask the right questions and engage in the proper interventions to be able to help the client then build resiliency around acknowledging and recognizing that those things are happening, build their awareness, and then therefore get to the point where they're able to resist all of their compulsions. So, RP, super important. We need to break the cycle, and the only way to do that is by removing that compulsive element. That way, if you remember the little OCD cycle that we showed you a moment ago, if you cut that compulsion part out, then you don't get the negative reinforcement anymore, and
mhm.
we're no longer sending those signals back to the brain.
Yep. Yep. Habituation curve. This is really talks about how we are looking to decrease anxiety levels, right? So with the habituation curve, we can see here. if you can see my mouse. If not, just look at the picture of the curve.
Yep, we can see it. We're good.
It's a table, right? So we have anxiety and then we have time, right? So initially your anxiety spikes up really high. There's also this belief that your anxiety might like increase infinitely, or you're going to lose control, collapse, die, right? There's some kind of like really scary thing that starts to happen at the peak. The story that OCD doesn't tell, though, is if you sit with it, so to speak. So if you practice response prevention, your anxiety is going to come down gradually over time. And what we want is we want people to learn, like, hey, I can tolerate the discomfort, and also learn that like the more I do it, the less intense my distress is and the less long lasting my distress is. So repeated exposures, you'll see that habituation where the distress doesn't start as high and comes down quicker till you get to a point where you're like, okay, yeah, like I got it. I can handle this.
Yeah, I like to tell my clients we want to repeat these exposures until they start to feel boring, till you're
Yep.
like, yeah, this doesn't really bother me anymore. That's a really
Hmm.
great place to get to.
Definitely.
So let's read aloud a case example, and I encourage you guys to some of those reflection questions at the bottom. Feel free to toss some ideas into the chat as I'm reading through this. So we have a client, 30-year-old, who identifies as non-binary and presents to treatment due to worries that they may harm or kill themselves. After recently watching a rerun of one of Anthony Bourdain's shows, Parts Unknown, the client reported experiencing intrusive thoughts and images of dying by suicide. Um, Including hanging themselves, slashing their wrists with knives. Since this began, the client no longer is cooking like they used to every night, and they are no longer going into restaurants or other settings where they may come into contact with any sort of sharp objects. The client has also removed all objects from the home that could be used to harm themselves, including anything that's sharp, shoelaces, belts, etc. The client reports that the thoughts are incredibly distressing and unwanted. Your suicide assessment shows that the client does not have any actual suicidal ideation, no desire, no plan, or intent to cause harm. So let's break this down. Danielle, I'll kind of toss these questions over to you as well. So if we think about this case vignette here, what's the obsession? What do we think the obsession is?
All right. So if we take a look, right, this person is really worried about what if they kill themselves.
Yep.
So we could keep the obsession as kind of simple as that, right? So what if I kill myself?
And I like wording the obsession in the form of a what if question because, like what we
Mhm.
spoke about earlier, that's the way that OCD often communicates to its victims. So, what if I killed myself? What if I harmed myself? That would really be the identifiable obsession here.
Mhm.
Any compulsions that we can kind of pull out of this case example?
Yeah. Okay. So we think about behaviors that they're doing either, where we can see them or in their head. It looks like some avoidance, right? So they're not cooking. They're not going to restaurants, avoiding knives, right? So we've got just a lot of avoidance happening, it looks like. And is that the main one that we kind of laid out here is avoidance? We could probably make a guess that they're doing mental compulsions, like giving themselves reassurance or maybe ruminating, but I think explicitly in the example, we've got a lot of avoidance.
Yeah, on the surface, we definitely see all avoidance there. But like you said, if we do a much more thorough assessment and we ask some good questions, we're definitely going to uncover other mental acts that are going on that the client probably is not privy to at this point.
Hmm.
And how can we apply ERP? Like, what would be the goals to starting treatment with this individual, either short term and or long term here?
Yeah, sure. So goals, right? Like we always want to have that collaborative, define with our client what's important to them, what do they want to get back into. But we could probably try to, we could probably make a leap here. They used to cook every night and now they don't, and they don't go out anymore to eat. So like those could probably be some goals we would work up to. So ways to build up to that, we could have our client practice, chopping stuff up with like a butter knife and then work up to, whatever knife is appropriate for whatever, the right tool for the job, right? So like, bread knives are like those big scary ones, right? So if you got to cut up to bread, work up to that kind of a knife versus, a knife you use for veggies or whatever. Um, so really having them use those kind of like, practical ways to expose themselves to the fear, like, hey, yeah, let's like work up to being able to use whatever knife you need to get to the job done. Or, let's work up to going out to a restaurant and maybe you order something where you need a butter knife, but you don't need like the steak knife, and then work up to ordering where you need a steak knife, right? So we could really play around and get creative with those kind of things.
Yeah, lots of gradual exposure opportunity there, and things that we take advantage of in day-to-day living, like being able to be in the shower and use a razor or having
Hmm.
shoelaces in your shoes. This individual's clearly not wearing belts anymore, things that they
Right.
probably once valued being able to do that now they have to avoid or feel like they need to avoid. So getting them to engage in their life and increasing their quality of life long term.
Definitely.
Great. Awesome. This was a good example to go through.
That was, yeah. So for our last couple minutes here, we'll talk about the benefits. Um might not spend too much time on ourselves maybe, and then we'll hop into some Q&A. So the benefits of being a specialist. This is, and maybe we give a little bit of background here. So Megan and I have similar backgrounds in terms of where we started and where we got to in terms of working in psychiatric hospitals, community mental health, right? And then really landing ourselves over here in becoming OCD and anxiety specialists. So one of the cool things is you find yourself as a professional, you get to really hone in on your own skill set. There's a treatment that works and you see it work, right? So this treatment is very behaviorally driven, so you see results, you tend to see them quick, and you see clients get better, which sometimes unfortunately might not be the case as much in other settings, as long as they're doing the work, you can stand out and be competitive in the market. And that really comes down to this high need and low demand, or high need and demand, right? So we talked about how many people OCD affects just in the US alone. And then in terms of providers, this is on the IOCDF website, which is the International OCD Foundation. There's only 2,700 providers listed, and that includes medication providers, so therapy and medication providers. Now, we have to keep in mind that not everybody who specializes is going to be a member of the IOCDF, right? So the data might be a little skewed, but even if it's, like 4,000 people, that still doesn't address the 2 to 3 million adults and 500,000 kids living with OCD. Um, One of the financial benefits, and I know that's sometimes like a, "Ooh, don't touch that topic because 'cause we're therapists," but, like, one of the financial benefits of being a specialist is you can charge more for your services because you're niched, right? You're providing specialty care. If we think about it in, like, a medical setting, right, you're gonna pay more, for seeing, like, a neurosurgeon versus a general surgeon, right? So if we kind of, think about it in that way, it makes sense. You've got a evidence-based treatment protocol and approach to follow versus feeling like you're kind of like throwing interventions and spaghetti at the wall and hoping something sticks. And since you're niche down, you have an opportunity to be looked at as an expert in your niche. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that was all beautiful. I'll just reiterate that this is such an amazing population to work
Hmm.
with. Being able to see somebody get better in a very short period of time is one of the number one ways to prevent burnout.
Hmm.
Personally, can speak to. It's just very rewarding to see people get better, knowing that your services are changing people's lives and being able to bring that to somebody in a very short time frame and giving them the tools that they can then independently use throughout the rest of their lifetime to manage something that otherwise could have really set them back in life. They can get on top of it. They can remain in a state of recovery where their symptoms are so minimal that they don't even meet criteria anymore. And that's really the goal of every individual that we work with, is to get them to that point.
Yeah, exactly. We want them to be their own therapist.
Yep. 100%.
All right, we're
So
gonna skip over ourselves. I was gonna
yeah,
say
I
we'll
was
get
going
to
to say we don't need to extra introduce ourselves, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time here. But we have a really great question in the chat, Danielle, that I'm going to throw to you first, and we can briefly
Sure.
talk on. And then if there's anybody else who wants to toss any questions in, now would be the time. We are happy to answer questions after the fact, though. If you need to hop off right away, feel free to reach out and email us. Um,
Do you want to type our
so
email in the chat?
yeah, you know what? Let's toss that in there for everybody. I'm terrible at multitasking, so I'm going to do that in a moment. I'm going to throw this question at you first, though. That way we can get to it. Um, Jarrett had asked, can something like scrupulosity develop from strict upbringing, religious beliefs, etc.? Great question.
Great question. Yes. Um, I I see it actually I see it a lot in people who have very strict um upbringings where like and especially when things don't start to quite fit into that like black and white mold anymore and there's like that room for it to really like grow and almost like fester in a way and pick on like oh, this isn't following like the guideline, like what do we do here, like oh my god, or am I doing it right? Especially if there's a lot of like fear instilled with it, like you have to do it this way or else you're going to go to hell or you're going to offend god or higher power or whatever, right? Like it can really just like feast on that and like a lot of rigidity can come into play, I would say.
Definitely. I totally agree with that. We know that trauma and triggering events early on in life can contribute largely to the development of OCD symptoms. So
Mhm.
100% that can be the case as well.
Yep, definitely.
Awesome. Any other questions that anybody wants to throw out in here for us? And if not, we can start to wrap things up as well.
Mm,
Sandra asked, as individuals grow, develop, mature, can or do their obsessions change? Great
great
question.
question.
Danielle, up to you. You want me to take this one? I'm happy to.
Yeah, you can. I took the first one. You can have this one.
Okay. So yes, definitely. I kind of compare OCD to like playing whack-a-mole,
Mm,
where the obsessions and the themes can change over time. Maybe somebody starts with contamination as their subtype, and then as they develop and grow, then maybe it turns into something like the just right OCD or the symmetry OCD. And then a few years later, it turns into something else. Somebody can also have multiple subtypes
mhm,
operating simultaneously. So that
mhm,
that we see very commonly too, where someone will come into treatment and they'll have one subtype that maybe is like the most distressing, but then there's others in the background that are also going on. I like to zoom out of OCD and really think about the process of it versus the content. So, regardless of the subtype or the theme that they're experiencing, it's the same loop that they're caught in, that same cycle,
mhm,
regardless of what the thoughts are saying. And unfortunately, OCD gets a little tricky and it's a little sinister because sometimes it'll hop to a new theme so that way the individual is then paying a lot of attention to it again. So this is something that we'll see in treatment, and
mhm,
there's a lot of skills that we develop as specialists to be able to address those moments when they get better with one theme and then all of a sudden this other theme ramps up. And that's
mhm.
really predictable with OCD as well.
Yeah, and it can change as our values change, right? So, when you're like a young single person living their own life, it might, have kind of one thing that it does, but then if you become in a committed relationship or marriage, it might change and shift and pick on your relationship. And then if you have children, then it might pick on, like, oh, what if harm happens to my children? So it can be very like developmental in that way too.
Yep, definitely. Being
Mhm,
in certain environments, right? So if you're in a school setting, there might be specific triggers there, but then you graduate from school and you're in
mhm,
a different environment and now the triggers shift. So then the theme might shift as well. So really
mhm,
great question and definitely something that we see more often than not.
definitely.
Great. Any last minute questions? Feel free to send them over to our email that I put in the chat for you guys. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. If you want to learn more about becoming a specialist, please check out our website as well, which hopefully all of you have at this point because you've registered through the webinar. But if you need anything or have any questions, please, please, please feel free to email us because we are happy to answer anything. And we love connecting with other professionals in the field and really sharing our passion. So thanks
Yeah.
for joining us
Thank
today.
you so much. All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye.